Good morning and welcome to Sunday School. We'll have an introduction to Black theology. This is the third part in the series. You can find the other two earlier in our YouTube listing, and we will have an organ prelude right after. So stay tuned. I can see the comment section over here. So if you have any questions, would like clarification or to share something, type it in the chat button and we'll go from there. All right. Thank you for being here. So I'll begin this third session with the same recap that the other sessions have, just to get us reoriented. Black theology contends that dominant cultures have corrupted Christianity, and the result is a mainstream faith-based empire that serves its own interests and not God's. Black theology affirms Blackness and Black ways of knowing God. I will be using Professor Dwight Hopkins' distinction of Black Theology USA to say that what I am discussing and outlining in this class is reflective of Black theology in the United States. So this would be context-specific versus global. This would not include, but hopefully points to Tewahedo, the Ethiopian church, African Christianity, and Afro-Caribbean Christianity. So we're going through Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. Howard Thurman was a work many in the Southern freedom and civil rights movement quoted and worked with. Martin Luther King was known for carrying Jesus and the Disinherited in his suit pocket while he marched. However, Howard Thurman lived primarily in Massachusetts and San Francisco. So when he writes about racism and its effects on the human soul, he's writing not just of the South, but of the entire United States. So we're reading this to talk about Black theologies and ways of knowing. This is the theology of the church and ways to learn about God. A side effect is that it's also useful to the anti-racism project. But unlike sort of the modern genre of anti-racism literature, this doesn't assume white people as an audience, but rather it affirms that anyone can, and I think should, be a student of Black theology. All right, so let's continue with Jesus and the Disinherited. The third chapter of Jesus and the Disinherited is titled Hate. And Howard Thurman, a theologian of God's work in the human heart and for the dignity of all, once again offers tremendous grace in this chapter. We'll go through his definition and then talk about how later theologians used and built off of his work. You may recall his writing about the hounds of hell, hate and fear. So he says, hate is another one of the hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the disinherited in and out of season. He writes, during times of war, hatred becomes quite respectable, even though it has to masquerade often under the guise of patriotism. He cites Pearl Harbor and anti-Asian actions taken in America after Pearl Harbor, because this is the weekend after 9/11. I'm thinking of anti-Islamic and anti-Arab propaganda and hate crimes. I'm also thinking of the false dichotomy in response to the movement for Black lives, that the assumption that patriotism is never critiquing or wanting better for our country, when I say we can all want better for it. He writes, hating is something of which we ought to be ashamed unless it provides for us a form of validation or prestige. He says hate becomes a useful negative emotion. And he says this catalyzes the human soul into positive violence. How was the Christian church of Thurman's time dealing with hatred? So he writes, Christianity has been almost sentimental in its effort to deal with hatred in human life. It has sought to get rid of hatred by preachments, by moralizing, and by platitudinous judgments. It has hesitated to analyze the basis of hatred and to evaluate it in terms of its possible significance. And saying the church does evaluate it in terms of its possible significance in the lives of people possessed by it. So he is kind of looking past the platitude towards the source, and he names two factors as really key to the unsuspecting growth of hatred in the human heart. He says, hatred begins in contact without fellowship. Contact without fellowship. Contact devoid of the primary overtures of warmth, fellow feeling, and genuineness. He also says, there may be the feeling of fellowship on one person's behalf. He says this would be a situation without mutuality. He uses the example of interactions between white and black people in the South, saying, his quote here, as long as the black person is named John or Mary and is aware of a subservient position like customer service. So John or Mary without any honorific or family name and the presumption of a first name basis. So contact without fellowship. I think a modern example of this, remember Thurman is writing in 1949, is there are all kinds of people and all kinds of things that we know through the internet or someone else's description. We may have read about something, seen something on social media, and think that we get it now. So knowing about someone or a political stance through the internet, someone else's description, our judgment, but not knowing somebody's story, not knowing them and not having any a relationship with mutuality leads to what Thurman calls contact without fellowship. He then says, contact without fellowship leads to unsympathetic understanding. Thurman uses the example of going to sit in someone's office and feeling the kind of scrutiny that makes you second guess about how well your vest is buttoned. He says, this assessment isn't about one's personal style and neatness, but hear it from the position as someone disinherited. The person with more social and legal power is looking to assess whether Thurman or the person of color conforms to their stereotypes and ideas of should and fit. I have a modern example of this. Maybe I shouldn't call my college years modern. That was a minute ago. But this vest thing reminds me of a conversation I had with a good friend. We're at a diner near the college campus. It was a Saturday late morning, and a lot of us were definitely dressed like it. I mean, it was New York in the fall, so sweatshirts, sweatpants. I was in college before leggings. But John was dressed in nice pants, button-down shirt, and we're making fun of him. Like, not going somewhere fancy, we're just going to the Palace Diner. And he, at first he was like, yeah, I just like to put in effort. Y'all are slobs. And then it was, okay, as a person of color, if I wear sweatpants, someone is going to think I'm the gardener and ask me to trim the hedges on campus. And that was a major moment for our reflection, and still is. I think that John's comment leads into the sympathetic understanding there. Thurman says, unsympathetic understanding is the fuel of charity and first aid, relationships without mutual dignity that can catalyze into hate. He shifts the focus from centering the powerful to centering the disinherited as he continues, saying hatred in the disinherited is born out of the great bitterness of sustained resentment. And remember, he says disinherited instead of a phrase like the poor. He would say disinherited or impoverished to remove the guiltlessness of the passive voice. So he says disinherited to say someone did the disinheriting. He says, let me illustrate this. Suppose you were one of 5 children in a family, and it happened again and again that there was just enough for 4 children in any given circumstances, and you were the one that had to do without. He said, if there was money for 4 pairs of shoes and 5 were needed, it was you who did without shoes. If there were 5 pieces of cake on the plate, 4 healthy slices and 1 small slice, you were given the small one. He says, at first when this happened, you overlooked it because you thought that your sisters and brothers, each in his turn, would have the same experience. But they did not. Then you complained quietly to the brother who was closest to you in understanding, and he said that you were being disloyal to your mother and father to say such a thing. In a moment of self-righteousness, you spoke to your father about it, and he spoke back so severely you decided not to mention it again, You kept watching. The discrimination continued. At night, when the lights were out and you were safely tucked away in bed, you reached into the quiet places of your little heart and lifted out your bundle of hates and resentments growing out of the family situation and said, they can keep me from talking about it to them, but they can't keep me from resenting it. I hate them for what they are doing to me. No one can prevent me there. Hatred becomes for you a source of validation of your personality. He writes this, it isn't this kind of attitude that developed in the mind and soul of the weak and the disinherited. They recognized at once that they were victims of a systematic denial of the rights and privileges that are theirs by virtue of their being human and by being a citizen. Thurman says they're offered this choice to deal with the estimate that their environment places on them, the judgment of their environment on them. He says, for the environment, though its power controlling and through its power controlling and prestige bearing representatives, has announced to them that they do not rate anything other than that which is visited upon them, sort of they deserve what they have. He says, if they accept this judgment, the grounds of their self-estimate is destroyed, and their acquiescence becomes an endorsement of the judgment in their environment. Because they are despised, they despise themselves. But Thurman is a theologian of the human heart, human dignity, and affirms everyone is a child of God. So he says this, there is hope when they reject this judgment. He says, if they reject the judgment, hatred may serve as a device for rebuilding. That step by perilous step, the foundation for human significance, so that from within the intensity of necessity, they declare their right to exist, despite the judgment of the environment. And he goes on to say that the hatred can be shed. Let's see. And of course, as a preacher, he always goes to Jesus. So he talks about how Jesus talks about hatred, saying that it is clear for the weak, hatred seems to serve a creative purpose. It may be judged harshly by impersonal ethical standards, but as long as the weak see it as being involved with the complicated technique of survival with dignity, it cannot be dislodged. He says Jesus understood this, and he puts himself into the mind of Jesus, Son of Man, and says, Jesus as a man, as Christ outside of time, and a man within his environment. How did he look on what his fellow people were going through? He says, what must have passed through his mind when he observed the contemptuous disregard for the Jews by the Romans, whose power had closed in on Israel? Thurman continues, hatred's final destruction is the core of the life of the hater. He says that hatred corrodes the human heart and soul and is deeply dangerous. It's not a recreational emotion. It imperils your soul. He says, while it lasts, burning in white heat, its effect seems positive and dynamic, but at last it turns to ash, for it guarantees a final isolation from one's fellows. It blinds the individual to all values of worth, even as they apply to himself and his fellows. Hatred bears deadly and bitter fruit. It is blind and non-discriminating. So when Thurman says that hatred is the final isolation from one's fellows, what I hear is that isolation began in contact without fellowship, contact without mutuality, and unsympathetic understanding. See. Last time we talked a little bit about James Cone. One of James Cone's major works is Martin and Malcolm. And he talks about the two trajectories from Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., how they met once, just one time, and how their trajectories in American politics were misunderstood at the time and in later scholarship. But here he begins with W.E.B. Du Bois, a turn-of-the-century thinker, talking about two-ness that stems from being an African in America. He says, here then is the dilemma, he wrote in The Conservation of Races. What, after all, am I? He says, am I an American or am I, his word, a Negro? Can I be both? And then James Cone sets up two strands of thought. I don't know, like all scholarly papers, you set up a framework and then you demolish it at the end. Integrationist thinkers who answer yes to, can I be both? And nationalist thinkers who have rejected the American side of their identity and affirmed the African side, saying, no, we cannot be both. He says that no Black thinker has been a pure integrationist or a pure nationalist, but all Black intellectuals have represented aspects of each, with emphasis moving in one direction or the other, usually at different points in their life. And he says this plays out in the stories of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He said, popular images of Martin and Malcolm seldom acknowledge their movement toward each other and their break with earlier deeply held convictions about America. Malcolm X's remark of chickens came home to roost is a point that he cites here. He says, when Malcolm X broke with Elijah Muhammad, his spiritual father in the Nation of Islam movement, this initiated a new stage in his thinking. He says, Malcolm X began to acknowledge the value of Martin Luther King's contribution to the Black freedom movement. He began to advocate for hope, that is, the participation of African Americans in the American political process. Cone continues, Martin Luther King's dream was shattered in the 1965-68 years as he observed the nightmare in America's cities and on the battlefields of Vietnam. He began to talk like Malcolm X. As their perspective shifts, they began to move toward each other. And Cone writes, in a future without assassination, what could this partnership have done? Another theologian I'd like to tell you about is the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. She is the canon theologian of the Washington National Cathedral and the dean of Episcopal Divinity School. And she writes in, I believe, 2015, a book called Black Bodies and the Justice of God, talking about the Stand Your Ground law. And she reflects on Howard Thurman, and she reflects on sort of the solution and the two strands of thought. Sorry, water break. Okay. So she writes, the Stand Your Ground law is an extension of English common law that gives the person a right to protect his or her castle. And Stand Your Ground law broadens the notion of castle to include one's body. She says, it permits certain individuals to protect their embodied castle whenever and wherever they feel threatened. Essentially, a person's body is his castle. In this regard, a person does not have to retreat from the place in which he or she is castled. They can stand their ground. And she asks this, who is perceived as threat, and who is allowed to be the lord or lady of their castle? She says, while this law was initially invoked as a reason for Trayvon Martin's slaying, it was not used as a formal defense. But nevertheless, stand your ground was mentioned in the court case and therefore available to the jury. She says, it signals a sociocultural climate that makes the destruction and death of Black bodies inevitable and gives permission. She says, it is this very climate that sustains the prison industrial complex. The repeated slaying of innocent Black bodies makes it clear that there is an urgent need for soul searching in this nation. Who is perceived as threat, and who is allowed to be the lord and lady of the castle? This, to me, comes back to our Howard Thurman's factors in hate. Who is perceived as threat, who is allowed to be lord and lady of the castle, maps onto unsympathetic understanding, contact without fellowship, and relationships without mutuality. So W.E.B. Du Bois says that the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back to slavery. He's referring to the brief period of Reconstruction, the attendant rise in rights and freedom, and then sort of the backlash of fear against this freedom. And there was an urgency to reinscribe Black people with a feared and fearful identity. Kelly Brown Douglas continues, the 21st century version of this construct is the criminal black body. The black body that was once marked as chattel is now marked as criminal. This construct serves the same purpose by relegating the black body to an unfree space. It preserves free space as white. This transformation began shortly after emancipation. She says, what has allowed this culture to become so acceptably deadly when it comes to the black body? Why does this culture seemingly pursue black bodies with murderous intent? She describes waking up her son every morning. She says, from the first day that my son was born, I told him every day, right in the morning, first thing, you are a child of God. God loves you. There is no one greater than you but God. And she did this, saying, I knew that my son would be growing up in a society that would despise him for his blackness. Therefore, I wanted to provide him with a piece of that black faith that would not allow the denigration of the Anglo-Saxon exceptional identity to be implanted deep within him. This sounds like Howard Thurman's meditation on the inward sea. You can find it in Meditations of the Heart. And he says that within every human soul, there is an inward sea. And in the middle of that inward sea, there is an altar. And before that altar is an angel with a flaming sword that guards the dignity and the life spark of your soul, and that nothing is placed on the altar. Nothing is placed on the altar in the middle of your inward sea without your consent. She then cites Howard Thurman saying, Howard Thurman says it best of all. He says that the message of faith to the enslaved that was crucial to hear is you are created in God's image. You are not slaves, you are God's children. God knows this, and now you do. And as theologians do, you always got to bring it back to the Bible. Moses, she goes to the Exodus as a major text and says, in giving Moses directions for setting the people of God free, the identity of God is clarified. Essentially, the Exodus story preserves the freedom of God, and it affirms the essence of God as freedom. The essence of God as freedom. Kelly Brown Douglas continues and brings it to the cross. She draws on the work that I cited last time, The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, and she continues to bring it into our modern news cycle. She says, on the cross, God takes on the very extremity of human hate to show the enormity of God's love. God's love has no bounds. It seeks to preserve the integrity and goodness of all creation, regardless of how far God must reach down into the constructs of human hate to do so. How far God must reach down. She says no one is out, like Thurman before her, she says that no one is outside of God's reach and God's power, that hate is corrosive, but it is not the final word. There is always redemption in Christ. She says this reveals that love knows no bounds. It reaches into the vilest realities of human hate and evil, and this love and the knowledge of its power has so much meaning in a stand-your-ground culture. She says, in the stand-your-ground war today, crucifixion comes in the form of gun violence. She says the Matthean question today might be, but Lord, where did we see you dying and on the cross? That comes from the Matthean question. She says that comes from Jesus' dialogue with his disciples when he says, I have seen you feed the poor and needy. But Lord, when did we see you? And Jesus would answer, she says, on a Florida sidewalk, at a Florida gas station, on a Michigan porch, on a street in North Carolina. As you did it to one of these black bodies, you did it to me. She says the tragedy of the cross is the tragedy of the stand-your-ground war in American culture. It is in the face of Trayvon dying on a sidewalk that we see Jesus dying on the cross. To know the extent of God's love, one must recognize the face of Jesus in the face of Trayvon Martin. She continues, just as Jesus' ministry showed his intimate bond with the demonized outcasts of his day, it also shows his commitment to fostering and nourishing life. In this regard, he is the embodied reality of the freedom of God, So this is the tie back to Exodus, the embodied reality of the freedom of God that is expressed as a life-giving force. Throughout his ministry, Jesus frees people from the clutches of death and returns them to a full life. This is evident in the stories of him restoring sight to the blind, making the lame to walk, and casting out demons. Jesus does not hand human bodies over to the power of death. She says there is not one story reported in the four Gospels in which Jesus cooperates with death. He takes on the powers of death and defeats them. The story of Jesus restoring Lazarus to life is the best illustration of Jesus doing this in his ministry. Death to life. Thurman writes of hatred is the death of the human soul, and Kelly Brown Douglas affirms death to life. Jesus will never abandon you to death. And both in this say hatred is powerful, it is corrosive, it is killing, but Jesus always has the final word. God is the essence of freedom and reaching into the human heart. This is a powerful response to hate, writing in, so these are theologians that have written from a span of human history that is both long and short in America, 1949 to 2015. And I hear tremendous grace and forgiveness in this. And if you would like to know more about any of these books or follow up with me in conversation about this, share your reflections, I would love that. We have a comment space open here, and my email is gail@holytrinitychurch.info. You can email me there. My cell phone number is on the church website. I would love to hear from you and talk about this. So the next session is on the next chapter in Jesus and the Disinherited, entitled Love. It'll be a different time than this one. So I look forward to that. I look forward to having that conversation with you. And Sam Herbert and I are starting a book and Bible study this October. We'll be meeting on Zoom for more people to feel comfortable participating. And we will read continuing our theme of reading Black theology, we will read Sisters in the Wilderness by Dolores Williams. Womanism will be a major topic of the next class on love, because female scholars have looked at the work of James Cone and how the mid-20th century elevated male thinkers and Black male theologians and did not privilege the work of Black women. And the answering theological method, womanism, is one that I'm excited to talk about. And if you would like to learn more, email me about joining that book and Bible study. All right, it's almost time for that organ prelude. Oh, hey, thank you, Ann Penny. All right, it was wonderful to do Sunday school with you. See you soon.